Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center webinar series, Maximizing Lifelong Brain Health in MS. Today's topic is Diet and Nutrition in MS with our registered dietitian, Lauren Ott. This program is going to run for about an hour, and you can submit questions for Lauren at any time by typing the message in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your computer screen, and we will receive those questions and ask them to Lauren throughout the presentation. So now I will turn it over to Lauren for our presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll click over. My presentation is called Nutrition, Facts, Myths, and How It's Done Right. So just to start a little about me, I am a registered dietitian here at the University of Colorado Anschutz Health and Wellness Center. I have my certification in adult weight management. At the center, I split my time between being a clinical dietitian through seeing patients one-on-one in the clinic here, and I'm also program manager for one of our weight loss programs here. So once we're finished, if you guys end up having any questions about any of our programs here at the center, I'm a good person to ask for that. I'm also the 9 News dietitian, so you can see me on 9 News every other Monday at 7:40 a.m. I've got a Facebook page, Instagram, website. I'm always posting healthy recipes and tips on there, so if you want to continue the education after this webinar, those are great places to go. And I've also included my email, and I'm happy to take any questions that might arise after this presentation via email as well. So a little bit about the center. We follow 5 pillars of health and wellness here. First is cutting-edge research, and we post all of our research on our website, which I've also included on this slide. We're always looking for research participants, which can be a really great way to get involved here at the center and receive free programming, free weight loss programs. And a lot of times those research participants get paid as well. So stay up to date on the website. There's some really cool opportunities on there. And if nothing else, you can learn about our research here at the center. We also use holistic education here. So we have dietitians such as myself and mental health professionals. We have industry-leading teams, so we have physicians, fitness experts, dietitians. We have a world-class facility and programs here, so if you haven't ever been to the center, I really encourage you to stop by and take a tour. I would be happy to take you on a tour, or our front desk can always take you on a tour, but we have state-of-the-art fitness center here. We've got steam rooms, saunas, lap pools. We have massage specialists, acupuncture. You name it, we probably have it. So if you've ever watched Extreme Weight Loss, that's our facility on there. It's kind of fun to get to show it off. So, and once again, our website is listed on this page here. I've also included some of our weight loss programs and services here. So we have groups that I mentioned earlier, and we also have individual weight loss counseling. We have a lot of body composition and metabolism tests here as well. So we offer things like the BOD, POD, and DEXA scans, which are going to tell you what your body composition is, so body fat percentage versus lean mass percentage. We have an RMR machine, which stands for resting metabolic rate. So if you've ever been curious about how many calories your body needs, we have a test that will tell you that, and I'll get a little more into what metabolic rate means here in a minute. We have several packages for massage, for personal training as well. So the number is at the bottom of your screen to call for the wellness clinic and set up any of those appointments or talk to you about pricing for that. All right, so to dive into our presentation today, my objectives in this presentation, first of all, maximizing lifelong brain health, maximizing overall health, and I think the biggest takeaway is that what we're doing here today is treating your whole body, not just your MS. So there's no such thing as an MS diet or particularly treating your MS. You've got to treat your whole body. And one of my favorite demonstrations of this concept is the wellness wheel that I have pictured on the right here. And basically, every color on this wellness wheel I like to think of as a different spoke on a wheel. And so you have things like emotional, environmental, intellectual, social, physical, spiritual, occupational. And if you were to remove any one of those colors, the wheel wouldn't function how it should. And I think what happens a lot in wellness is people will focus on a couple of these spokes on the wheel, expecting to achieve overall wellness, and it doesn't work that way. You have to achieve every one of these spokes to be able to achieve overall wellness. So I want to start this off with showing you a couple of cereal boxes. And my point here is that boxes can be deceiving. So look at this box of Captain Crunch and then the box of Smart Start. And just from looking at the labels, I want you to think to yourself, which of these would you say would be the healthier cereal? And my guess is, and maybe I'm wrong, but my guess is you probably picked the Smart Start. The colors, the blueberries, the milk, it's got antioxidants written huge on the front. My guess is you probably picked the Smart Start as the healthier choice. But what's interesting is that when you flip these over and you start looking at the labels, you realize the Captain Crunch has 12 grams of sugar per serving, and the Smart Start has 14 grams of sugar per serving. Not only that, but the Smart Start has 190 calories per serving, while the Captain Crunch has 110 calories per serving. Now, there are other things, such as the Smart Start is a whole grain, whereas the Captain Crunch is not. The Smart Start does have the added antioxidants, which the Captain Crunch does not. But the takeaway here is that you cannot rely on the front of a label to decide what is the healthier choice. Food manufacturers are really smart, and their job is to sell us a product. It is not to keep us healthy. So don't rely on your front of the packages. Always look at the nutrition fact label, which is what we'll get into now. So a lot of times when I start to talk about nutrition fact labels, people start to kind of zone out a bit because they're like, oh, well, I know how to read a nutrition fact label, obviously. But there's a lot more to it, I think, than people realize. So just a few of the basics. You always want to start with the serving size because, once again, food manufacturers are tricky, and you might have something that looks like an individually sized package, but it may have 1.5 or 2 servings in that package. So first thing to look at is always your serving size there. Then you want to get to your total calories per serving. Now, total calories mean nothing if you don't know the serving size. If there's 2 servings in a pack and you're assuming there's only 1, that means there's twice the calories that you think there are. So the next you want to look to calories. Now we'll get into calories in a minute in terms of how many calories you need, but once you've determined how many calories you need per day, you can determine if a product is going to fit within your calorie recommendation or not. I like to think of calories like a budget. So just like I budget my money, I'm going to budget my calories for a day. So can I afford that amount of calories or not? So the nutrients you want to limit are going to be total fat, cholesterol, and sodium. Anytime you see something on a nutrition fact label that's indented, so for example, you see total fat in bold there, and then indented next to that, you'll see saturated fat and trans fat. That's because saturated and trans fat are types of total fat. So they make up that 10 grams of total fat that you see on this sample nutrition fact label here. Same thing goes for total carbohydrates. So both sugar and fiber are types of total carbohydrates. So basically they're just breaking down where that 15 grams of carbohydrates come from on this label. Now, some tricky things on a label include sugars. So you'll notice there's no % daily value next to sugars on this label, and that's because as of right now, we do not have a % daily value that we're aiming for. Now, if anyone just heard the American Guidelines for Americans, Dietary Guidelines for Americans just came out, and we actually now do have a sugar recommendation. However, the FDA still hasn't accepted this onto its nutrition fact labels yet. So you still won't see the % daily value there. Another really confusing thing about sugar on a label is that the sugar on this label is not differentiating added versus natural sugars. So for example, if we had a nutrition fact label slapped on an orange, you're going to see that that orange has a lot of sugar in there, probably somewhere around 15 grams of sugar. But remember that the sugars in an orange are natural sugars. So what we're really want to be looking at is, are these sugars in our labels natural sugars or added sugars? And just from looking at a label, it's impossible to know if it's a natural or an added sugar. So what you really want to look at is your ingredient list. If you've never checked out the ingredient list before, they are listed in order of volume. So the first ingredient on that list has the highest volume, second ingredient has the second highest volume, so on and so forth. So if you see sugar, especially in one of those top 3 ingredients, that's how you're going to know that whatever that product is has a high amount of added sugars in there. And we'll get a little bit more into sugars and how to look for added sugars in a minute, but I think it is important to remember that on a nutrition fact label, you are not differentiating added versus natural. It's just giving you all sugars on the label right now. Anything with a percent daily value next to it on the label, anything with 5% or less daily value is considered a low source of that nutrient, and anything with 20% or more is considered a high source of that nutrient. And so keep in mind, there are certain things you want to be high, such as your vitamins and minerals at the bottom of the sheet and fiber, and there are certain things you want to keep low, such as total fat, total sodium, total cholesterol. So those are the biggest things that you want to look for on a nutrition fact label. Now there are something to look forward to. There are some proposed changes that we should be seeing on our labels in the next year. A few of those changes, they are actually going to change sugars so that it differentiates added versus natural sugars, which is really exciting. That's probably the change that I'm most excited about. They're going to take away calories from fat, because the more research we've done, we realize that really doesn't matter how many of the calories are coming from fat. They're going to change the serving size. So for example, a lot of Coke bottles right now look like they would be 1 serving, but in actuality, they usually have 1.5 to 2 servings in there. And so products like that are actually going to be labeled as 1 serving for a Coke bottle or 1 serving for the snack bags of chips. So anything that is deceiving like that now, they are going to change. And they're also going to make calories and serving size more prominent on the label. So they will be bolded, they will be in a larger font size, so that it really attracts your attention to those things first, because those are the things that matter. I can't say the most, but they're the things that a lot of people miss on the labels. So those are some things to look forward to within the next year or two on your nutrition fact labels. Now, calculating calories, I mentioned earlier, every person has a different calorie amount that they should be striving for each day. You know, I hear a lot in my job at the clinic here that, oh, all women need 1,200 calories and all men need 2,000 calories, and you can't do that. You can't say that every age or sex or gender needs the same amount of calories. It's totally dependent on your height, your weight, your age, your gender, and your activity level. So what I have here on your screen is a way to calculate your BMR, or your basal metabolic rate. Now, this is the same thing as your resting metabolic rate that I mentioned earlier. Resting metabolic rate is essentially the amount of calories that your body needs at rest to make your heart beat, your lungs function, your cells regenerate, all of that good stuff. So I've put the equation on the screen for men and women to calculate their basal or resting metabolic rates. Now, I realize that a lot of people, including myself, don't love math. So I've also included a website on here for you to go to, and it does all of the work for you in calculating what your resting metabolic rate needs are. Now, like I mentioned, resting metabolic rate is the amount of calories that your body needs at rest. And so obviously we're not at rest all day long. We're up and moving and eating and talking. So depending on your activity level in a day, we'll add what's called an activity factor onto your basal metabolic rate. So you'll want to multiply your basal metabolic rate by whatever the appropriate activity factor on the screen is. Now, I will say this, a lot of people will say, oh, well, I'm pretty active. I move around a lot during the day. I get in, a 30-minute run every day. Most people are going to be at an activity factor of 1.2, or what it calls sedentary there on the screen. That is not because everybody's lazy. It's just because it is actually much harder to attain one of those higher activity levels than we think. It requires a lot more activity than we think. And it's I also like to err on the side of underestimating calorie needs, because Harvard recently did a study, and what they told us is that people underestimate their calorie intake by 50%. That's 50%, and we overestimate our calorie expenditure by 50%. And so I think it's smart just to err on the side of underestimating here, knowing that calorie counting is hard. So once you've calculated your final number here, if your goal is to maintain your current weight, that's the amount of calories that you'll want to aim for each day. If your goal is weight loss, you will want to subtract 500 from your total number to achieve about a pound of weight loss per week. So how I got that, there are 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. So coming out at a calorie deficit of 500 calories a day will mean a 3,500 calorie deficit per week, which will lead to a pound of weight loss per week. So if you're sitting here wondering, well, gosh, I don't know if I need to maintain or lose, the next thing you'll want to look at is the BMI chart. Now, being at a healthy weight is extremely important for everyone, but especially with MS patients. Being overweight can increase fatigue. It can place stress on joints and demands on the heart and lungs. It can increase your risk of illness, such as coronary heart disease, diabetes, hypertension. The list goes on and on. So if you've never seen a BMI chart before, that's what you see on your screen right now. So what you can do is find your height in centimeters, and I apologize, I know no one uses centimeters to calculate their height. So what you can do is you can either go to the website on the screen, the freebmicalculator.net, or if you figure out what your height is in inches, you can multiply inches by 2.54 to figure out your height in centimeters. So once you figure out your height, you find your weight in kilograms on the top, you meet them in the middle, and from that you can figure out which BMI category you fall into. Now, the BMI that we're striving for is a BMI of between 18.5 and 24.9, and that is what is considered a healthy or normal BMI there. And from that, you can kind of figure out what your goal should be in terms of weight loss or weight maintenance. So now that we've talked about calories, I want to jump into macronutrients. So what a macronutrient is, this is either carbohydrates, protein, or fats in your diet. So from your calorie goal, about 45 to 65% of your calories should come from carbohydrates, 15 to 25% of your calories should come from protein, and 20 to 35% of your calories should come from fats. Now, from your carbohydrates, less than 10% should come from added sugars. So keep in mind, added sugars does not include things like fruit or vegetables or dairy. This is going to be things like sugars added to products like cereals and breads and cookies and things like that. One way to figure out how much protein your body needs is to take your total body weight in kilograms. So if you take your weight in pounds and divide that by 2.2, that will then tell you what your body weight is in kilograms. And multiply that anywhere from 0.8 to 2 grams per kilogram to figure out exactly how many grams of protein you need per day. Now, for my average person, I'm going to recommend about 0.8 grams per kilogram. Someone that's much more active, maybe working on lean muscle building, I'll probably put them closer to 1 to 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. Very rarely do I go all the way up to 2 grams per kilogram, so I probably wouldn't calculate yourself up to that point. Of your total fat, less than 7% should come from saturated fats, and less than 1% should come from trans fats. So we'll get more into total fat a little later in the presentation, but your saturated and your trans fats, those are your quote-unquote bad fats that are going to clog your arteries, increase serum cholesterol levels, things like that. So that's why those two fats we really want to watch in our diets. Now, when we talk about calorie counting, I think it's helpful to know that carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram, protein has 4 calories per gram, fat has 9 calories per gram, and alcohol has 7 calories per gram. So this is important to know because I think that certain macronutrients get bad reputations, such as carbohydrates are probably one of the biggest ones that I hear people kind of stressing about. But when you look at this chart, carbohydrates have only 4 calories per gram. So yeah, overeating any macronutrient will lead to weight gain, but there's nothing special about carbohydrates that lead to weight gain. They're actually one of the lower calorie per gram macronutrients out there. When you look at fat at 9 calories per gram, it has over twice the caloric density of carbohydrates and protein. It doesn't mean that fat is a bad macronutrient either. Sometimes I like to think of fat as the F word because that's how people think of fat, and that's definitely not the case. We need fat in our diets. But do keep in mind our portion sizes have to be much, much smaller of those high-fat foods because they have over twice the caloric density of our other macronutrients. So I think that's just important to remember. So I want to get into the different macronutrients now in a little bit more detail, but I think it first helps to look at the plate method. So if you guys lived in the 90s like I did, you probably remember the food guide pyramid. And it was super confusing even for myself as a dietitian, and we've actually done away with the food guide pyramid and we've replaced it now with the plate method. So choosemyplate.gov is a really fun website to go to, click around on. But the basis of it is we've got this plate, and the best way to split your plate up at each meal is to have half of your plate filled with non-starchy vegetables and fruits, a fourth of your plate filled with grains, a fourth of your plate filled with protein, and a dairy source at that meal as well. Now, one thing I also like to point out about this Choose My Plate method is that they're basing this off of a 9-inch diameter plate, and it does make a huge difference of what size plate you're using for the plate method. Obviously, the bigger the plate we use, typically the larger the portion sizes we serve ourselves. So go home today and measure your plates. I think it's interesting. Most plates these days are somewhere between 11 and 13-inch diameter, which inevitably leads to larger portion sizes. So I was searching for 9-inch diameter plates the other day and was hard-pressed to find them. So go measure your plates. Maybe try to find smaller plates if you can to help with portion sizes. So that's the plate method. Now we'll get into each macronutrient in a little bit more detail. So starting with protein, I've got protein circled on the Choose My Plate sample on the right-hand side of the page. So once again, this should be about a fourth of your plate size. So protein is used mostly for growth and repair, specifically for lean muscle mass. We want to anchor each and every meal with protein, and I think this is a big mistake I see a lot of my clients make, is that they tend to back into their protein. So they'll have a really, really high protein dinner, yet at breakfast and at lunch they're eating a very, very minimal amount of protein, and that's going to affect lean muscle mass, that's going to affect satiety levels throughout the day. So really, really make sure that you're evenly splitting that protein throughout each meal, because it's not so important. Well, it is important to make sure you're getting enough protein in a day, but just as important as it is to get enough protein in a day, it's just as important to split that protein up evenly throughout your meals and snacks. So protein typically comes from animals like meat, poultry, seafood, and eggs. There are also vegetarian sources of protein. So some of those are going to be barley, couscous, quinoa, whole grains, legumes, beans, soy, such as tofu, edamame, soy nuts, tempeh, and nuts. So it really doesn't matter if you're getting your protein from animal or vegetarian sources. In fact, I actually recommend a combination of the two, getting a few meatless meals in per week and using vegetarian sources, and then getting some of your protein from meat sources as well. So a few little did you knows on here. So a 3-ounce serving of meat can vary anywhere from 70 to 300 calories. That's obviously a huge variance in calories there. And the biggest reason for that is the variance in fat content of a lot of our protein sources. So for example, a pork tenderloin, that's going to be a very, very lean source of meat. So that's going to be on the lower end of your calories. And then along those same lines, if I were to have a serving of prime rib, that is a very, very high fat meat source, and that's going to be a lot closer to the higher end of the calorie range there. So those two cuts of meat are going to provide us with about the same amount of protein. However, the fat and therefore the calorie content of those two meat portions are going to vary significantly. So a 3-ounce portion of protein, by the way, is about the size of a deck of cards. You can also use the palm of your hand to dictate what a 3-ounce portion of meat might look like. So that's size and thickness. So the phrase loin typically indicates a lower fat cut. So I mentioned a tenderloin earlier. Sirloin is also a very lean cut of meat. The grade of the meat can often describe the fat content as well. A lot of people assume that the grade indicates the quality of the meat, and that is definitely not the case. It actually indicates the fat content or marbling of the meat. So select is usually the leanest cut. Choice is a moderate amount of fat, and then prime has the highest amount of fat. And that prime is typically what you'll find in a restaurant setting. So prime rib is a great example of that. So moving on to our carbohydrates now. This on our plate method is going to be 1/4 of our plate once again, as you can see from the picture there. Carbohydrates provide glucose, which is our body's main source of fuel. So like I mentioned earlier, I think carbohydrates are very misconceived. A lot of people think that they lead to weight gain, that they should be avoided as much as possible. However, they are our body's main source of fuel. Now, the difference lies in the types of carbohydrates we choose. We want to aim for more of our whole grains or our complex carbohydrates versus our refined grains or our simple carbohydrates. So whole grains are really one of our best sources of fiber, and the fiber's job is to help move food through our digestive tract to keep us feeling full for longer. It also helps us to stabilize blood sugars throughout the day, which helps with mood, it helps with energy levels, it helps with satiety levels. And one thing I didn't mention on here is it also helps with cholesterol levels. So eating a high amount of fiber can actually help to lower your serum cholesterol levels as well. So lots and lots of reasons why getting enough fiber in our diets is important. And like I mentioned, whole grains are one of our best sources of fiber that we can have in our diet. So half of your grains should come from whole grains. And honestly, in my professional opinion, I think even more than half of your grains should come from whole grains. But kind of the minimum goal is that half of your grains you want to come from whole grains. So carbohydrates include things like breads, pastas, cereals, peas, potatoes, corn, legumes, beans. So remember that they don't only come from starches like a lot of people think of when we think of carbohydrates. A lot of our starchy veggies are also going to be a source of carbohydrates. So 1 ounce of cold cereal has many different portion sizes. And this is also a big mistake I see a lot of my clients make, is that they'll look at one cereal nutrition fact label and they will assume that all of the cereals on the shelf have the same portion size. But cereal is actually measured by weight, not by volume. And so a cereal like Grape Nuts, for example, is going to have a much, much smaller portion size than a cereal like Corn Flakes, because by weight, it weighs a lot more, so therefore volume is going to be much smaller. So just make sure that you're not falling into that trap when you are working on looking at nutrition fact labels at the store. So the little stamp that you see on the right of your screen, the little yellow stamp, they've started adding those to a lot of products on the market to show that it is a whole grain. So anytime you see that yellow stamp, you can be assured that that product is at least made with whole grains. Now, it may not be a 100% whole grain product, but it is at least made using whole grain. So that's an easy way to spot some of your whole grain foods out there. However, not all foods that are whole grain have this label, so it's really important to learn how to look for whole grains on a label. So I've included a bunch of whole grain products here on the screen. So take a look at these and kind of think to yourself, which of these do you think are whole grain? And which of these do you think are not? And it might surprise you which of these actually are and are not whole grain. So the first one, starting from the top left corner, is our instant oatmeal. A lot of people assume that because it's instant, it is not a whole grain, but surprisingly, it is still a whole grain. Now, I'm not trying to say that instant oatmeal is just as good as your steel-cut oatmeal or your old-fashioned oatmeal, but it is actually still a whole grain. Now, the steel-cut oats, I kind of just gave it away, but those are also a whole grain, and they're definitely kind of the top of the line when it comes to your oats. The next is cream of wheat, and a lot of people see that word wheat and assume that it is a whole grain. However, cream of wheat is actually not a whole grain product, and I'll get into what makes a whole grain here in a minute, but cream of wheat is actually not a whole grain. Now, they do make cream of wheat in whole wheat varieties, so you can buy it whole grain, but not all cream of wheat is whole grain. The next product there is our whole grain white bread. Now, at first glance, most people would think, oh, well, it's white bread, so therefore it's not a whole grain. This actually is a whole wheat product, so there is a type of wheat that is white, and as long as they're keeping it whole, and like I said, I'll get into what makes a product whole grain, but as long as they're keeping that white wheat in its whole form, white bread can still be a whole grain product, which I know is blowing some of your minds right now, but you just have to look at the label and make sure it says whole grain white bread, not just white bread. At the bottom left, you see our multi-grain English muffins there. This one throws a lot of clients off. They're brown colored, they say multi-grain, I think they say healthier, it says fiber and light on the label. These are actually not a whole grain product. So if you were to flip this product over and look at the nutrition fact label, or better yet, look at the ingredients, none of the ingredients on the label of this product are whole grain ingredients. So this is one thing to really watch out for when checking for whole grains, is that they can label a product as being multigrain or 7-grain or wheat, but it may not necessarily be whole wheat or whole grains. And same thing with the color of the product or the fiber content of the product. Just because the product is brown or has a high fiber content does not necessarily mean that the product is whole grain. So the other English muffins here, they're harder to read, but those say 7-grain on them, and probably not a shocker, these are also not a whole grain product there. So you'd want to still flip that label over. And my general rule of thumb is that somewhere in the first 3 ingredients, you should see the word whole. So it should say whole wheat, whole oat, whole rye, whole barley, whole corn, and that's how you know if the product is a whole grain or not. The Golden Grahams there, because they are a children's cereal, they are relatively high in sugar. A lot of people assume that they are not a whole grain. These actually are a whole grain, and you can see from the front of the package here that it is a whole grain. Corn Flakes, the last of the bunch here, they are a healthier cereal. They are lower in sugar. However, Corn Flakes are actually not a whole grain cereal. So bottom line here, you've really got to look at your ingredient list to make sure the product is a whole grain product. And what whole grain means is basically that all 3 parts of the grain are still intact. So the germ, the endosperm, and the bran, all 3 of those need to be still intact to be considered a whole grain. All right, so moving on to fruit, which is also a type of carbohydrate, and you can see fruit on your My Plate on the right side of the screen there. Our goal with fruit is 2 to 3 servings per day. Now, fruit juices and dried fruit do count as some of these 2 to 3 servings. However, important things to remember about fruit juices and dried fruit is that the portion sizes are very, very small for these products. Typically, dried fruit is going to be about 1/4 of a cup serving size max, sometimes even as small as a tablespoon. And one big important thing to remember about these is that some of these, in fact, I would say it's safe to say most of these have some sort of added sugar in them, including dried fruit. I mean, if you've ever looked at the ingredients of dried fruits at a supermarket, majority of the dried fruits on the shelves have 2 ingredients in them. Whatever the fruit is, comma, sugar. So when you're looking at dried fruits, try to find a dried fruit that has 1 ingredient being whatever the fruit is for that dried fruit. So a question I want you guys to think about, will a half cup of orange juice or a whole orange provide more nutrition and be more filling? Calories are going to be pretty similar for these, but the winner is definitely going to be the whole orange, and there's several reasons behind that. First of all, when fruit juice is processed, they are taking out most, if not all, of the pulp in that juice. And the pulp is our major fiber source. So most fruit juices on the market do not have any fiber in them. And as I mentioned earlier, fiber is very filling. It's what controls our blood sugars. So we definitely, there's one reason why the whole orange is a better source. Also, a lot of fruit juices have added sugars in them. So oranges are already a relatively high sugar food, but it is a natural sugar. And then to take that already high in natural sugar product and add more sugar to it, it's just going to lead to a very, very high sugar product. Another reason is that most of the time when fruit juices are processed, they've taken all of the vitamins and minerals out, and then oftentimes they fortify them back in. So they may still have some of the vitamins and minerals, but they're synthetic. They've been fortified. They're not coming straight from nature, and therefore our bodies just aren't utilizing them in the way they do vitamins and minerals from nature. And the last thing to think about is, how long would it take you to drink a half a cup of orange juice? Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. And then think about how long it would take you to eat a whole orange. It's going to take you much, much longer to eat that whole orange versus the juice. And the longer it takes us to eat something, typically the more filled and the more satisfied we are. So all in all, whole fruit is always a better choice than fruit juice if you have access to whole fruits. Next are our vegetables. So as you can see, those should be at least half, if not more, of our plate at each meal. We should aim for 4 to 6 vegetable servings per day, and one serving is about half a cup of cooked vegetables or 1 cup of raw vegetables. Most Americans eat just 1 cup of vegetables and half a cup of fruit per day, so that's not even a fourth of what our recommended serving sizes are. So fruits and veggies are definitely an area that a lot of people could stand to improve in. Veggies equal, in my mind, more bang for your buck. So I would say this is one of my biggest nutrition tips that I have, is really load up your meals, especially with your non-starchy veggies, because they're extremely high in fiber, they're high in fluids, they're high in vitamins, they're high in minerals, but they're very low in calories. So therefore, you're getting more bang for your buck. You're not spending a whole lot of calories to get a whole lot of nutrition. And I mean, one of my biggest tricks is beefing all of your meals up. So even try hiding it in some of your foods. So throwing it in soups, sauces, casseroles, any recipe that I make, I'm notorious for throwing extra veggies above and beyond what the recipe calls for into that recipe. Keeping frozen non-starchy vegetables handy is also a great tip. A lot of people assume that frozen veggies are not as nutritious, and that is absolutely not true. Frozen veggies are frozen at their peak of freshness, and therefore they are just as high, if not higher, in vitamins and minerals than your fresh fruits and veggies are. So keeping those frozen ones on hand are great, and these days they make them so good that you can just steam them in the bag and they taste just about as good as fresh. Just make sure you're buying frozen veggies that don't have added sugars or sodium or butter sauce or whatever it might be on those. Next is our dairy, which is also a source of carbohydrates. So we should aim for 2 to 3 servings a day of dairy. The reason for this is that dairy is high in calcium and is also high in protein. The biggest goal here is to choose fat-free or low-fat dairy. Some of our high-fat dairy is going to be higher in calories and also higher in saturated fat or cholesterol that we do want to watch out for. A serving of dairy should be about a baseball or your fist, so that's going to be the equivalent of a cup when it comes to something like yogurt, milk, or cottage cheese. And if we're talking about cheese products, our serving size should be about the size of our index finger, which is the equivalent of 1 ounce of cheese. Now, I always like to mention dairy substitutes because I know there's a lot of people out there who have lactose intolerant or for whatever reason may be avoiding dairy. And I think dairy substitutes are great. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that most dairy alternatives are low in protein. So things like almond milk, rice milk, coconut milk, they only contain about 1 gram of protein per 8 ounces, whereas cow's milk has 8 grams of protein per 8 ounces. So it doesn't mean that they're bad products. I just wouldn't use it assuming that it's a good protein source. You want to make sure you're still getting another source of protein in at that meal. The only one that differentiates is soy milk. Soy milk does have 8 grams of protein per serving, just like cow's milk does. So they are all still great sources of calcium. They're still great in addition to your diet, but just make sure you're aware that they're not typically as good as protein sources as cow's milk is. So fiber, this is a type of carbohydrate. I mentioned earlier there are 2 types of carbohydrates, fiber and sugar. So constipation can be a huge result of MS. So fiber is one of the biggest things in our diet that helps relieve constipation or prevent constipation. What we're aiming for per day is 25 to 30 grams of fiber. Fiber gives us a more lasting sense of fullness, so it helps control our blood sugar, therefore keeping us full for longer. Good sources of fiber are going to be whole grains, nuts, seeds, vegetables, and fruits. And some tips to fit more fiber into your diet. First of all, start your day with a high-fiber breakfast cereal. There are a ton of great high-fiber cereals out there. And by the way, what I consider high fiber is 5 grams or more of fiber per serving. And keep in mind that this doesn't have to be cold breakfast cereal either. This could be something like oatmeal, which is one of my favorite breakfast cereals, or even quinoa. There are sweet and savory breakfast recipes for things like quinoa to do in the morning, which is also a fun, easy thing to do for breakfast. Switch to whole grain breads and pastas. So like I mentioned earlier, looking for whole grains within the first 3 ingredients. Eating things like beans, peas, lentils, brown rice, barley, and other whole grains can be fun. And play around with some whole grains that maybe you haven't tried before, like barley or farro or couscous. Snack on dried fruits and ready-to-eat raw vegetables. And make sure that you have vegetables at each and every meal. So sugar, this is a big topic. There are so many sources of added sugars in our diet, and they can really sneak up on us. I think that we know the obvious sources like cookies and cakes and brownies, but what we don't always look at is protein bars or protein powders or breads and things like that to see what their sugar content is. And that's where sugar can really creep up in our diets. So when it comes to sugar, women should limit their added sugar to 6 teaspoons per day, or the equivalent of about 24 grams. And men should limit their added sugar intake to 9 teaspoons per day, or about 36 grams. So 1 teaspoon of sugar is the equivalent of 4 grams, by the way. And I do want to point out that this is for your added sugars. So this is not for your natural sugars. So things like fruits and vegetables and dairy are not included in your added sugar. Well, dairy is not included, assuming that it is just pure dairy. Now, if we're talking chocolate milk, obviously that chocolate in your milk would count as an added sugar. But I think that word added confuses a lot of people, especially when it comes to products like honey or agave. A lot of people will say, well, honey and agave come from nature, so aren't those a natural sugar? Well, yes, they are a natural source of sugar, but as soon as we add them into our cereal or granola or protein bars or whatever, they then become an added sugar. So even though they originally came from nature, they are still considered an added source of sugar in our diets. So when you're trying to figure out if a product has added sugar or not, I mentioned earlier the biggest thing to look at is the ingredients. If you see sugar anywhere in the ingredients, that is a sign that that product has added sugar, especially if the word sugar is within the first 3 ingredients. Now, one thing to remember is that unfortunately nutrition fact labels aren't just going to say sugar all of the time. There are many, many different names for added sugar on a nutrition fact label. So I've included 43, which is a lot, of those names for added sugar to look for on a label. Biggest giveaways, if it has the word syrup or if it ends in the letters OSE or OS, that's a pretty good indicator that that is a source of added sugar in that product.
So we've got a couple of questions, one of them about sugar and adding it to protein. You were just talking about adding like honey or agave into cereal or a meal. What about adding, a natural derivative of honey to a product like Greek yogurt, which has very little sugar? Is that an acceptable form of sweetener in that product or no?
That's a great question. Now, when it comes to products like honey and agave, they do come from nature, so they are going to be higher in antioxidants than something like table sugar. However, what's important to remember is that once we eat these foods, our body breaks them down in the exact same way that they break down table sugar. So they have the same caloric density, they have the same amount of sugar per serving as table sugar does, so they are going to spike our blood sugars up in the exact same way that table sugar does. However, with all of that being said, some amount of added sugar is acceptable in our diet. So I mentioned earlier, for women, 24 grams. So if some of that 24 grams you want to be a teaspoon or so of honey added into your Greek yogurt, I think that's definitely acceptable. I love Greek yogurt as a part of a healthy diet, and if that's what's going to help you to get that product in, all the more power to you. I would just really encourage you to watch the amount of honey that you're adding because it can add up quickly. And also you might try out some alternatives. So I like adding things like cinnamon or cocoa powder or nuts. Sometimes I've even been known to stir a little almond butter or peanut butter into my Greek yogurt, and even trying out savory Greek yogurt, so doing things like adding a little bit of turmeric or curry powder or the powdered ranch dressing flavoring into my Greek yogurt to do a savory Greek yogurt. Those are all fun ways to play around with it because I understand that it's pretty bitter tasting just by itself. But play around with some of those other alternatives as well. But no, I definitely don't think that on occasion adding a teaspoon or so of honey will do any harm. Just make sure it is fitting in to your daily added sugar limit each day.
Great, and we do have another question about the paleo diet and the Walls diet, and we will get to those a little bit later here in a few minutes.
Yep, and then after I get through those, if you still have questions, let me know. So next, going to fat. Now, there is no specific spot on the plate for fats, and there's a reason for that. It's that most of the foods we eat already contain fat, so we don't need a special plate on the My Plate method for fat. Now, fat, I mentioned earlier, a lot of people think of as the F word. We've got to avoid fat. Fat is bad for us. However, we need fat to survive. It's what carries our fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamins A, D, E, and K. It insulates our organs, and some fats are essential fatty acids, meaning that our bodies cannot create those fats by themselves. We must consume them to get those fatty acids. So the serving size for fats, our thumb is about a tablespoon serving size. So this will be used for things like salad dressings, peanut butters, oils, and the tip of our thumb is about a teaspoon serving size. So this is going to be used for things like butter, margarine, and mayonnaise. So did you know that a small handful of nuts or seeds can contain up to 200 calories? And this really goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that fat has 9 calories per gram. So even though we absolutely need fat in our diets, our portion size is going to be much, much smaller of these foods. So really watch out. Yes, I encourage you to eat things like nuts and seeds, but really watch your serving size of those foods. Same thing with avocado and olives. A lot of people forget that those are actually fat sources, and so they are also going to be much higher in calories than certain other vegetables or fruits because they are a fatty source. Now, when it comes to breaking down our 4 different types of fats, there are 4 major dietary fats: saturated, trans, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And one question I always like to ask my clients is, will eating good fats versus bad fats help me to lose weight? And the answer there is no. Eating good fats versus bad fats is not going to do anything for your weight. all fat has 9 calories per gram, and when it comes to weight loss, weight gain, it boils down to calories in versus calories out. And so good fats and bad fats have the same caloric density. Where eating good fats will help is with heart health and overall health. So your good fats, or I like to call them better fats, because I think using the word good insinuates that you can eat as much as you want, which is not the case. But your better fats are going to be things like your monounsaturated and your polyunsaturated fats. And your bad fats are going to be things like your saturated and your trans fats. Now, I mentioned earlier, saturated fat has a goal of less than 7% of our daily calories, and trans fat, we have a goal of less than 1% of our daily calories. We do not actually have a goal in terms of percent of our daily calories for mono and polyunsaturated fats. The biggest goal is to just make sure that majority of your total fats are coming from those better sources of fats versus your artery clogging saturated and trans fats. And the biggest goal with polyunsaturated fats is to make sure that you're eating high omega-3 fish about twice per week. And I'll get into what some of those high omega-3 fish are here in a little bit. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through those different types of fats, but if you guys have any questions at the end as to what some of those different types are, let me know. I want to get to sodium now. So our daily requirement for sodium is 2,300 milligrams or less per day. Some of our higher sodium products are things like canned soups, processed meats, snack foods, salad dressings, and breads. Believe it or not, bread I think is an area that people don't think of as being high sodium, but it absolutely can be. And when you're looking at a nutrition fact label, what you want to aim for when it comes to sodium content is 140 milligrams or less is what's considered a low sodium product. So in the picture I have on here, it just shows how quickly sodium can add up. So in this seemingly normal day of breakfast cereal, a turkey sandwich and a cup of soup, a slice of pizza with a salad, this person ended up with 3,100 milligrams of sodium. So just really be careful and be conscious that sodium can add up really, really quickly in your day, and you really want to make sure that you're checking out your nutrition fact labels. Portion control. It wouldn't make sense to talk about food and calories if we weren't talking about portion control. So one of my favorite ways to assure that you're staying within your correct portions is the hand model. So obviously you can use things like measuring cups and food scales, but we don't always have those products with us. So we always have our hands with us, which is why I like this portion control hand model. So again, for the sake of time, I won't go over this, but this is a really great slide to refer back to when it comes to trying to predict your portion sizes of different foods. And vitamin D. So that we know that low vitamin D levels are associated with a higher risk of developing MS, and that high vitamin D levels are associated with a lower risk of developing MS. So my biggest recommendation here is have your vitamin D levels checked by your physician. We want your vitamin D levels to be at least at a level of 30 nanograms per milliliter. So your doctor will be able to tell you your recommended amount of vitamin D depending on your levels. But I'm going to encourage each and every one of you, if you haven't already, to go get your vitamin D levels checked. So a question that I get asked a lot is there a special MS diet? And there actually is not. So this quote from the National MS Society says, although there is no special MS diet, what and how you eat can make a difference in your energy level, bladder and bowel function, and overall health. And that is absolutely true. So although there is not a special MS diet, diet and physical activity absolutely make a difference in your overall health and well-being. So what I want to go over quickly with you guys are there are several diets out there that they do have research backing that have been shown to help with MS. However, none of these diets are evidence-based, meaning that most of this research has not been able to be replicated yet. Now, that doesn't mean that in the next year or so that we won't come back saying, actually, yes, this is evidence-based. But right now, none of these are evidence-based, but there is a lot of research leading to showing that some of these diets can help with MS. So the first being the SWANK diet. So This is a very low-fat diet developed by Dr. Roy Swank. It bans all dairy, gluten, legumes, saturated fat from animal sources. It puts a high stress on fish and fish oils. So Dr. Swank was able to show that 95% of his patients who adopted this diet following an early diagnosis of MS had a good chance of remaining free from further disability. However, other researchers have not been able to duplicate this yet. So we don't know quite yet if this is a diet to recommend, but it's definitely research that's out there. And the next is the Walls protocol. So this was created by Dr. Terry Walls, and it goes in 3 phases. So it uses kind of paleo principles to achieve a ketogenic diet, and what it means by ketogenic is a high-fat, low-carb, moderate protein diet. So basically your body is using fat as a fuel source versus carbs as a fuel source. This diet includes no gluten, no eggs, no dairy, no refined oils, limited sugar, and no processed foods. It includes organic, grass-fed, and wild-caught foods, no grains, legumes, soy, or white potatoes, and it limits starchy vegetables and fruits. So one of the biggest things that's really tough for research out there with all of these different MS diets is that a lot of times we're unsure if the diet is working or maybe if the patient is just going into remission, and that's what makes it really, really tough to evidence-base any of these diets with actually being effective. The next is the Mediterranean diet. This is primarily plant-based foods. It replaces butter with healthy fats such as olive oil. It uses a lot of herbs and spices in place of salt, which I always am going to encourage people to do. It limits red meat to no more than a few times per month. It uses a lot of fish and poultry, so at least twice a week, which is about what I'd recommend anyway, like I mentioned earlier. You use red wine in moderation, and I like to point out that this is optional, so don't think that you need to add a bunch of red wine to your diet if you're not already drinking. And it also emphasizes the importance of being physically active. And you'll see sort of a lot of overlap with a lot of these diets, and that's because a lot of these diets, although they're not evidence-based, a lot of the research that they're showing, we know that it's important for most healthy diets. So the next is the anti-inflammatory diet. We know that when inflammation occurs, it can cause damage and illness, including MS. So this diet includes a high amount of fruits and vegetables, including a wide variety of colors, which I'm also going to recommend a wide variety of colors. That will give you a wide variety of vitamins and minerals. Aim for 1 to 2 servings of beans or legumes and 3 to 5 servings of whole grains per day. Eliminate trans fat, and one way to find trans fat in a label is to look for partially hydrogenated oil in the ingredients. You want to reduce saturated fat. Aim for 5 to 7 servings of healthy monounsaturated fats or omega-3s. So I mentioned earlier those high omega-3 fish, and those are going to be salmon, tuna, sardines, anchovies, and other cold water fish. So trout, herring, halibut are also sources of those high omega-3 fish. Reduce your intake of high-fat animal proteins. And this diet also incorporates a lot of herbs and spices such as turmeric, ginger, curry, garlic, cinnamon. It uses a lot of water and tea, specifically green tea, and eats sweets sparingly. Next is antioxidants. So we know that antioxidants protect cells from damage caused by free radicals, or otherwise known as oxidants, hence the free radicals or antioxidants. So there is preliminary evidence suggesting that oxidants might be a factor in the damage to myelin and nerve fibers in MS, and we're specifically looking at antioxidants like vitamin C and E. So the biggest thing here is that there is some question in the safety of taking antioxidant supplements for people with MS. So what I'm going to encourage for people who want to try to follow a diet high in antioxidants is to get food-based sources and steer clear right now from any supplements. The next is gluten. So there's definitely some suggestions out there that antibodies directed against gluten and wheat may play a role in the development of MS. So gluten is a protein in certain grains such as wheat, rye, and barley. Occasionally it's found in oats if they're processed in the same plants that process any of the other gluten grains out there.
We have a question from the audience.
Oh, yeah.
Are vegetables a good source of antioxidants?
Vegetables are absolutely. Fruits and veggies are really our best sources of antioxidants. Certain herbs and spices are also great sources of antioxidants. And tea, and believe it or not, coffee is actually a decent source of antioxidants as well, but tea is definitely a better source of antioxidants. So fruits, veggies, tea, herbs, spices, those are probably going to be our best sources of antioxidants out there. So great question.
Great.
And like I mentioned earlier, the biggest thing is aiming for a variety of colors in our fruits and veggies, because that's how we get the most variance in those antioxidants as well. So 7% of MS patients try complementary and alternative medicinal treatments, often without informing their physician. So my biggest piece of advice, if you're thinking about trying any of the quote-unquote MS diets, consult your physician first. It may or may not be appropriate for you. And one thing that I always ask my clients who are thinking about trying out any of these diets is to make sure that it's a diet that is sustainable for them. Because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go on an incredibly restrictive ketogenic diet if you'll only be able to stick with it for a month and then you'll fall off track. So things to think about are, do I have a family that I'm also feeding? Is this something that I can sustainably cook for myself and meal prep for the rest of my life? Because it doesn't make sense to go on a diet that you can't stick with for the rest of your life. So.
And a real quick question about fats.
Yeah.
We have someone asking about the addition of coconut oil and or using it as a substitute to other oils.
Yep, that's a great question, and that's kind of one of those really trendy, taboo topics right now. So the thing with coconut oil, and I mentioned kind of evidence-based versus non-evidence-based earlier, and coconut oil falls into that same category. So there's a lot of research right now out there about coconut oil. However, there is no evidence-based research showing that coconut oil is any better than any of our other oils. And basically that just means that we have not been able to replicate the same outcomes in a lot of these studies. And so what studies are showing is that coconut oil, about half of the fat in coconut oil is from medium-chain triglycerides, and the other half is from long-chain triglycerides. And so medium-chain triglycerides are actually processed in our bodies a different way than long-chain triglycerides are. And they're actually processed straight through our liver versus having to go through our whole digestive tract, which actually leads to less fat storage, which is a really good thing. So a lot of researchers out there are saying, well, hey, coconut oil is high in MCT oil, and therefore will it lead to less fat gain? But the problem is a lot of the research out there that's been done on these MCT oils has been done on 100% MCT oil. And like I just mentioned, coconut oil is only about 40 to 50% MCT oil. So you can't take a study done on 100% MCT oil and apply it to a product that's only about 40 to 50% MCT oil. And so when they've replicated these studies on coconut oil versus the MCT oil, they are not showing the same results. And therefore, right now, I'm not recommending coconut oil to my clients. It's not a bad product, and I always tell people if you like it in stir fries or Thai food or whatever, by all means use it, but don't go and throw out all of your canola oil and olive oil quite yet until there's been a little bit more research done on coconut oil. And just like with any oil, it still is going to have 120 calories per tablespoon. So I also wouldn't go in and add a bunch of it to your diet because you're just adding a lot of unnecessary calories. All right. So managing MS symptoms with diet, and I know we're almost out of time, so I'll try to get through these fairly quickly. The first of these symptoms is fatigue. Biggest tips here, don't go more than 4 hours without eating. That's going to lead to really low blood sugars, which in turn is going to lead to fatigue. So stock up on some ready-to-eat healthy snack items that don't require any prep. So things like nuts, bars, fruits, Greek yogurt like someone mentioned earlier, low-fat cottage cheese, string cheese. The pouched tunas are always an easy one. You want to gather ingredients that you need before you start cooking. I always love the pre-cut, pre-washed vegetables. I use them. I think it's worth the extra buck or so to have somebody else cut them up for me. And you might even think about using a tall stool to minimize standing while you cook. Another huge tip I have is double up on recipes and freeze the meals for the next time your energy is low. So if you're grilling chicken breasts, for example, don't just throw 1 or 2 on the grill. Throw 5 or 6 on there and freeze the rest for later when you need them. Sleep is a huge thing. I do not recommend eating within 2 hours of bedtime. That can affect how quickly you get into your deep REM sleep, which is that restorative sleep. You want to avoid caffeine 8 to 14 hours before bedtime. Most people don't realize caffeine can stay in your blood system up to 14 hours. So you may be someone that is sensitive to that. Really watch out. Avoid alcohol too close to bedtime. Try to keep exercise to the morning, not right before bed, because exercising right before bed can actually make you more awake. Avoid blue light before bed, so that's on things like a cell phone or an iPad, computer. You want to establish a relaxing bedtime routine and try to keep a regular sleep and wake cycle, meaning that you wake up and go to sleep at similar times every single day. When it comes to managing bladder symptoms, I see a lot of my MS clients avoiding liquids altogether, and you absolutely do not want to do that. That can lead to dry mouth, loss of appetite, swallowing difficulties, deficiencies in certain nutrients, and also an increased risk of urinary tract infections. So you want to take regular water breaks all day long. One thing I do is bring a big water bottle to work, and I have the goal of getting through 2 of those water bottles in a day, so you can make small goals like that for yourself. Water down your meals, so doing things like eating soups with your meals or high fluid veggies with your meals can help you to get more fluids in. Try things like low-fat milk, sparkling water, cool herb teas, or infusing water. That's one of my favorite things, throwing berries, cucumber, mint into my water to make it a little bit more exciting. You want to travel with a supply of water, so a lot of people forget to bring water on airplanes and things like that can actually be dehydrating. So a lot of airports, including DIA, actually have water bottle fill stations now, which is awesome. Limit things like cola, coffee, caffeinated teas. Those can be bladder irritants, so you want to try to avoid those as much as possible. When it comes to bowel symptoms, first of all, constipation. To go along with fluids, same thing. Not getting adequate fluids can lead to constipation, so make sure you're drinking enough. Getting your 25 to 30 grams of fiber a day and staying active can also help prevent constipation as well. When it comes to loss of bowel control, you want to control or avoid constipation by doing the things I just talked about, practicing stress management and decreasing laxative use. And when it comes to diarrhea, you may want to get tested for food allergies or sensitivities, and you may also have sensitivities to things like spicy foods or dairy products. So my recommendation is try limiting those foods for a while or avoiding those foods for a while and see if that doesn't help improve your symptoms. Change in activity level can lead to diarrhea infection, which you'd obviously want to see a physician about. And same thing with constipation. Actually getting enough fiber can also help prevent diarrhea as well by bulking stools up a little bit. Depression. Eating at regular intervals during the day to avoid low blood sugars can help improve mood as well. Practicing stress management, so things like deep breathing, meditation, exercise, progressive muscle relaxation. Really find some me time each and every day, and also see your physician if you are experiencing severe symptoms of depression. So some quick practical strategies for food prep. Buying frozen veggie burgers is a great thing to keep on hand. Tyson makes great grilled and ready pre-cooked chicken that are excellent. They're free of preservatives. Frozen veggies that I mentioned earlier are great. Pre-chopped fruits and veggies are great to have on hand. Believe it or not, canned fruits and veggies, as long as you're buying the fruits canned in water and the veggies low sodium, are excellent products to have on hand, and they are also canned at the peak of freshness, so they're also just as good for you as fresh. Nut butters are great. They actually make pre-cooked frozen quinoa and brown rice now, which, I mean, they're so easy to just pop in the microwave and go. Canned tuna, canned salmon, as long as they're canned in water, are great and easy to use. Canned beans and lentils, my biggest trick with those is just rinse them off in a colander before you use them. Pre-made guacamole, I love. Pre-hard-boiled eggs are easy. String cheese, Greek yogurt, low-fat cheese. There are so many great products out there these days that are quick, easy, low maintenance, but still healthy for you. cooking tools. I love, love, love using my crock pot, throwing some canned foods in there in the morning, and by the time I get home, it's ready to go. And it also typically cooks quite a large portion, so you can eat off of this for days. I have a fun little egg poacher product that I use at home. I love eggs. They're cheap. They're easy. Tupperware is great for storing leftovers. Food processor makes it easy to avoid chopping foods. And obviously the George Foreman for grilled meats is really quick and easy to use. Action steps. So a few things that I want you to do after the presentation today. Go home and make a list of 5 go-to, quick, easy, simple, tasty meals. Do the same thing with 5 go-to snacks. Make a comfort list, so really working on that stress management side of things. Add exercise into your weekly calendar. And last thing, try tracking your food for a week to see your calories and macronutrients. That's absolutely the only way that you'll know how you're doing in terms of getting in all of your needs is tracking. I love a program called MyFitnessPal. It's free, it's quick, it's easy. They have a phone app and they have an online website. I've listed some of my resources here, and I think we have just a few minutes for any other questions.
Lauren, this has been great. Thank you so much. We do have time for one more question.
All right.
It looks like it's going to be about short-chain fatty acids and the benefit for the microbiome.
So that's another one of those things that there is a lot of research out there right now. Now, this is a product that, as far as I know, you can't purchase over the counter. I'm not sure that it's maybe the most sustainable thing right now. In terms of microbiome, I mean, my biggest recommendations are obviously eating whole foods, getting in a variety of fibers, probiotics from foods like yogurts and beans, lentils, and I'm not someone that's going to recommend the short-chain fatty acids. To be honest with you, I don't know a whole lot about some of the research out there about them, but it's also, as far as I know, not one of an evidence-based food out there. So same thing goes with the coconut oil, is that until I see more evidence-based research, it's probably not something that I'm going to recommend. But I could be sitting here in a year giving this presentation recommending that, so we'll see.
Great. Well, I hope that everybody really enjoyed this presentation and have now some actionable, tangible steps that they can incorporate into their lives and into their daily meal planning and the things that they're eating. And just some housekeeping, so everybody knows this presentation, including the slides, will be archived on the Rocky Mountain MS Center website, and that website is mscenter.org. It usually takes us a couple of days to get that video online, but what that means is that you have access to all the information that Lauren just gave us, and so you can spend some time with your family sitting around and making some meal plans and scheduling things so that any changes or adjustments in your diet and lifestyle are sustainable with this resource. And if anybody has any other questions about the presentation, please feel free to shoot us an email at the center at info@mscenter.org, and we can try to get them over to Lauren to get you some answers. Lauren, thank you so much for all of your time. You've been a great resource to us, and if anybody would like to reach out to Lauren, her contact information, like she did mention, is at the beginning of the presentation on her About Me slide. So, Lauren, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.